A free bird leaps on the back of the wind and floats downstream till the current ends and dips his wing in the orange sun rays and dares to climb the sky. But a bird that stalks down his narrow cage can seldom see through his bars of rage. His wings are clipped and his feet are tied, so he opens his throat to sing. The caged bird sings with a fearful thrill of things unknown but long for still, and his tune is heard on the distant hill, for the caged bird sings of freedom. The free bird thinks of another breeze, and the trade winds soft through the sighing trees, and the fat worms waiting on the down bright lawn, and he names the sky his own. But a caged bird stands on the grave of dreams, his shadow shouts on a nightmare scream. His wings are clipped and his feet are tied, so he opens his throat to sing. The caged bird sings with a fearful thrill of things unknown but long for still, and his tune is heard on the distant hill, for the caged bird sings of freedom.
Before we begin explaining and analyzing the poem, I think a bit of historical background of the poem and also of Maya Angelou would be beneficial to understanding the poem even better. Now, Maya Angelou was famous and notorious for including issues of racism, discrimination, and oppression that was held against the African American community in her work, in her literary work. Back then, African Americans were subjected to oppression as slaves since the year 1865. Not only that, even after the end of slavery era, the acts of racism continued with the segregation, where Americans segregate or don't allow black people and white people to sit in the same bus, share the same toilet, or even go to the same school together. Now, because of this segregation, because of the racism, a bunch of young African Americans formed the civil rights movement, which Maya Angelou also joined. Now, this civil rights movement was made to combat and create awareness to the society of the rights of African Americans as human beings. The author, Maya Angelou. Margaret Annie Johnson was born on the 4th of April 1928 in St. Louis, Missouri. She later passed away on the 20th of May 2014. Before Maya joined the arts industry, she worked as a cocktail waitress, a cook, and even a prostitute. Later on, she discovered she had talent in dancing, and her career started from there. She had a broad career as a singer, dancer, an actress, a composer, and she was also Hollywood's female black director. However, she became famous for her literary work. One of her most famous work is the book I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, which is sort of her biography on growing up as a victim of rape and also a black male. Not only that, Maya also was a civil rights activist. She worked hand in hand with Dr. Martin Luther King, which is one of the most greatest civil rights activists during that time in America. She was also working with Malcolm X. Later on,
The poem talks about the author's experience on the discrimination and segregation among African American. There are two distinguished experiences between African American and white American. As you can see in the poem, the bird in the cage represents African American slaves who have no rights and freedom, as opposed to the free bird, which represents white American.
The purpose of this poem is to describe the two contrasting lives of two birds, the free bird and the caged bird. Now, the caged bird suffers in captivity and sings to express its desires to be free, while the free bird soars in the sky and gets the first bite of fat worms for food. Now, Maya Angelou uses the birds as symbols to paint a picture of the discrimination and oppression that was put on the African American community at that time. Not only that, her use of the term caged bird can also be related to how African American was literally being caged as slaves during the segregation era. Now, this poem expresses the amount of unfairness in privilege and options given to the oppressor and how unsettling it made the author feel. Now, the message of this poem is the comparison and different treatments given to African American and Caucasians at that time. The poet included the life of the free bird to emphasize and make clear of the indifference and unfair treatment given to African American and Caucasian. Due to how heartfelt this poem was written, it can be assumed that Maya was sending a message of her experiences being an African American female at a time where racism was prominent in the United States. The first theme of the poem is oppression. This theme can be seen through the caged bird's perspective of living in the cage. The caged bird had limited opportunities to live its life as a bird, and the only thing it could do was to sing. Abolitionist Frederick Douglass once said that slaves sing most when they are happy. And the cause of the caged bird's unhappiness was not only because it was caged, but also because how it saw the free bird can fly in the sky without being restricted. This theme captures the essence of racism that was and still is significant in America to this day. The next theme in this poem is freedom. Now, this theme can be seen through the free bird. Unlike the caged bird, the free bird is allowed to do whatever it pleases. It is allowed to fly in the sky, it is allowed to flow according to the river's flow and eat the fattest available. The freedom given to the free bird shows how cruel oppression was at that time. The fact that the free bird is free highlights how severe the unfairness was. How come a bird was not allowed to live as a bird? So that is the purpose, theme, and message of this.
Next, emotion and mood. At the beginning of the poem, the emotion starts with happiness and carefree. The bird can fly freely and can claim the territory as he likes. However, in stanza 2 and 3, it revealed the emotional changes. The author described the caged bird in a way that the readers can feel the pain. For example, but a bird that stalks down his narrow cage can seldom see through his bars of rage. His wings are clipped and his feet are tied, so he opens his throat and sings. It shows sorrow emotion. The caged bird has no opportunity of living a free life, just like the free bird. He is helpless. In stanza 2, the caged bird lives in a narrow cage and can barely see its surrounding, meaning that the view is limited. Next emotion is furious. In stanza 2, 3, and 5, the caged bird is angry but unable to do anything because his wings are clipped and his feet are tied. He does not have the rights to be free as a normal bird. Meanwhile, the free bird are having a carefree life. He can go anywhere he wants. He can fly anytime that he wants. It shows that African American was in pain and rage because they were longing for freedom and liberty. They were begging for their rights because freedom is a basic human rights for each individual despite of their race, religion, and gender. However, their voice was unheard because they were minorities. Apart from that, the emotion that is portrayed in the poem is fear, because even though the bird is angry, the caged bird is angry and furious, but he also feared to seek for freedom. You can see by the way he sings. It shows that his voice is trembling, and it shows that he is not singing for a happy song, but he is actually crying for help. However, his voice barely can be heard. It shows that nobody cares and none of the action taken to help him. In the context of African American history, many African Americans tried to liberate themselves, but their voice had turned into deaf ears, and in fact, some of them were killed. After reading the poem, we feel sympathized for the caged bird due to the injustice. Based on stanza 1 and 4, it shows that the free bird is enjoying his life, the freedom and a lot of opportunity that available for him. Meanwhile, the caged bird lives in fear.
I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings is a 6-stanza poem. Each stanza in this poem differs in length. Now, this poem is a free verse poem with no rhyming scheme. However, there is repetition of stanza, which is in stanza 3 and stanza 6.
The language used is vivid and appropriate to the subject matter. The figurative language is not complex, yet able to produce poem that can touch readers' heart and deliver the intended purpose, which is criticism towards racial discrimination. For example, the use of birds to represent slavery and injustice initiate better emotion and feelings. Because we personally think that if the poet uses the word Black American and White American explicitly, maybe the readers cannot really connect with the emotion in the poem. However, if the use of birds in the poem, it might have helped the readers to fully understand the emotion that the poet is trying to deliver. Apart from that, the contradicting words to describe the two birds explain the injustice and the pain of oppression. For example, narrow cage, fearful thrill, clipped, tied, rage, nightmare, screams. It is meant for the caged bird, which explain the pain of oppression. Meanwhile, floats, breeze, dawn, bright lawn, fatworms are for the free bird, which explained about how the white people receive all the rights and all the opportunity. The words to describe the free bird are vary as compared to the caged bird, because the caged bird use words that are repetitive. It portrays the limited choices and rights among African American, because that is all that they can do as compared to the free bird, as compared to white American. However, we think that the readers need to have some background knowledge regarding the oppression of Black people in order to fully understand the purpose of the poem and the emotion.
Maya Angelou's use of symbolism is subtle yet gives a prominent impact to the message of this poem. The first symbolism that can be seen is the birds themselves. The birds in the poem symbolizes race, where the caged bird is the African American community, while the free bird is Caucasians or white people. However, it can also be interpreted that the symbolism of caged and free birds can also be applied to other races, communities, or even individuals. Each person can interpret the symbolism in their own perspective. Basically, the free bird is the oppressor and the caged bird is the oppressed. I'll give you an example. In this era where money plays an important role, caged symbolize low-income society, while the free bird symbolizes the upper-class society. The next symbolism is the cage. Cage in this poem symbolizes oppression. the caged birds are restricted from having a life. In stanza 2, the persona claims that a bird that stalks down his narrow cage can seldom see through his bars of rage. This means that the caged birds are oppressed to the point that they do not know and think they are allowed to be mad at the discrimination that is thrown against them. Then, following the lines, the persona also said that his wings are clipped and his feet are tied. The birds are oppressed to the point that even their mobility are restricted from moving. So this shows how in the cage the birds movements, the birds emotions are controlled by the people outside of the cage. The cage also signifies about a situation of being trapped. African Americans are constantly trapped in a country where they are outsider. Even after years of reform, people still consider them as the people who come to the country, not the people who belong to the country. The third symbolism is sing. The caged bird often sings. There is repetitions in stanzas 2, 3, 5, and 6 that the caged bird often opens his throat and sings. So I think that singing in this poem symbolizes a cry for help. When first reading it, I thought that the bird really likes to sing. However, upon analyzing, I come to conclude that the birds don't sing for pleasure. They sing as a way of escapism, as their cry for help. It is mentioned earlier that the bird's wings are clipped and their feet are tied. This means that the bird has no way to escape. Its limbs are being tied. Their only way to escape is to sing, because only their throat is a part of their body that is not restricted to anything. So that so they cries for the soaring birds or the free birds to hear their singing. I also mentioned earlier that during the segregation era, the slaves often sing when they are very mad. So this shows that to the African American, singing is also their way of comforting themselves from rage. Not only that, Maya Angelou also felt that singing is her escape. She was a then. She often sings as her way to express her desires to be free. The last symbolism is fat worms. Not just any worms, fat worms. The fat worms in this poem symbolizes opportunity and food. Fat worms are only attainable by the free birds. The caged birds are nowhere near of getting the fat worms. The free birds have access to these worms. They're not just they're fat worms. This shows how the free birds are given more than enough resources, more than enough food to stay alive. The fat worm also symbolizes the amount of opportunity the free birds get. Not only that, the caged bird should be sad that the worms are being eaten by the free bird, right? The worms' lives are being taken away. But to them, being that caged, being that oppressed, they even see that the worms have even more freedom than they do because they're not in a cage. Okay, the next imagery would be irony. I only found one situational irony, which is that the caged bird continues to sing from the beginning of the poem to the end of the poem, even though they know that freedom to them is far from reachable. Because, come on, their limbs are tied, their wings are clipped. How can they even being free? However, they continue to sing. In my opinion, I think that they didn't stop singing because to them, if they stop singing, if the caged bird stops singing, it means that they have given up on life. They have given up on their hopes of being free. So I think an irony. The next imagery would be oxymoron. Now there is only one oxymoron, which is grave of dream. Dream should be something that is magical, something that is that symbolizes happiness. However, in the poem, the poet symbolizes. The next imagery would be oxymoron. So there is one oxymoron in this poem, which is grave of dream. Now, when you hear the word grave, you think about death, you think about dying. And when you hear the word dream, you think about happiness, imagination, or something that is magical. But the poet puts grave of dream together in line because I think to the poet that the caged bird's dreams are somewhat non-existent. It's basically saying that there is no use in dreaming because they have no freedom and no chances of being free. And then personification. So there are a few personifications in the poem, which is shadow shout, and then nightmare scream, and also sighing trees.
For the movement, it is regular due to enjambment and repetition in the poem. The rhythm is regular to make the readers feel the emotion in the poem.
Next is sounds. I think there are no significant sounds in this poem. However, the author plays a lot with the technique of repetition. As you can see in stanza 3 and 6, the same verse is repeated again and again. The significance of the repetition is that it is the author's of emphasizing or highlighting the oppression dealt by the caged bird. I think, and also the author often repeated the verb sings multiple times in the stanza of the caged birds. I think this conveys a message or channeling a message that no matter how loud or how often the caged cry for help or sing, the free bird will continue to soar and ignore the bird's cries for help. And lastly would be rhyme. The poem Caged Bird itself has no specific rhyming scheme. However, in each stanza there are a few lines that rhyme with each other. For example, in stanza 2, line 1 and 2, the word cage and rich rhyme, while in stanza 3 and 6, the lines 2, 4 and 6 rhymes with trill, hill and still.
In our opinion, the poet has successfully delivered the meaning of the poem. The poem has many metaphors, yet it is still comprehensible. The poet has used language that is not complicated, but able to initiate the empathy towards the discrimination of African American people. In our opinion, the poem able to spread the awareness of race segregation and social discrimination that was happened in America, since most of the time many people view America or white American as a civilized society and country. In irony, the truth is they had manipulated the African American, and up until these days this discrimination and racism are still exist. Thus, the metaphor for the caged bird and free bird reflects on the importance of freedom and liberty. Overall, this excellent literary piece has delivered a great criticism on racial discrimination.